So we turn to that passage that Stephen read for us in 2 Samuel chapter 19 and on into chapter 20. In this passage we have three sections. First of all, chapter 19 verse 40 to chapter 20 verse 2, a childish quarrel. And let's face it, it was a childish quarrel that arose between the 10 tribes of Israel and the 2 of Judah. And then secondly, verses 3 to 13 of chapter 20, Joab's murder of Amasa. And then thirdly, verses 14 to 23, Joab's unilateral peace settlement with no word to David about it, and the murder of Sheba. And what we're going to see is the way in which this childish quarrel develops into 2 murders and a unilateral peace settlement. All sorts of things mushroom out of a childish argument. And we're going to see that the Lord loves to get in amongst the Lord's people. The devil loves to get in amongst the Lord's people and to cause division. If you're familiar with that chapter 12 of Revelation, we read there how the old dragon was there waiting for the bride, the church, to bring forth the Son. But he couldn't get the Son because he was snatched back to heaven. And so ever since then, the devil has been persecuting the church, and the church is driven out into the wilderness, and there God sustains her until that day of his final return. Well, this is, if you like, one of the early days, the devil in amongst the Lord's people, causing this increasing rift between Israel and Judah. So let's look, having given that overview of the sort of pattern that we're going to see, let's look at this first section, chapter 19, verse 20 to chapter 2 and verse 20, verse 2. In verse 40, we notice the king went to Gilgal, and Chimham went on with him, and all the people of Judah conducted the king, and also half the people of Israel. Now, I don't suppose that appears to be a very big thing to you. It certainly didn't to me. But it stimulates suspicion. It stimulates suspicion in the minds of the people of Israel. In verse 41, behold, all the men of Israel came to the king and said unto the king, why have our brethren the men of Judah stolen thee away, and have brought the king and his household and all David's men with him over Jordan? What's going on? We think there's some devious plan going on here. Some ulterior motive, they suspect. Verse 42, and all the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, because the king is near to king to us. Wherefore then, be ye so angry in this matter? Have we eaten at all of the king's cost, or hath he given us any gift? We're closer blood relatives, say Judah, than you people of Israel. Not a very clever response. It could have been far more diplomatic. But we stand upon our rights. And so now it's like a playground quarrel. In verse 43, and all the men of Israel answered the men of Judah and said, we have 10 parts in the king. They'd only got 2 tribes. Israel had 10 tribes. He's more ours than he is yours. You can see the temperature rising in this situation. And verse 43 goes on, and the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. Just one thing leading to another, needling each other. And then we go over into chapter 20 and verse 1. And there happened to be there a man of Belial, a wicked man, whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjamite. He blew a trumpet and said, we have no part in David, neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel. An opportunist, an evil man. And he says, we have no part. We have no part in David. Go back to verse 43 of chapter 19. The men of Israel answered the men of Judah and said, we have 10 parts in the king. You've only got 2. But now in the heat of the argument, they've gone full circle. And they're willing to follow Sheba, who says, we've got no part in David. He's nothing to us. And so you see how this rift builds up. They're just needling each other. Now I want to take you to Psalm 133, and you might like to turn to it. Let me just read it. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. That's what they'd lost. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. It is like the precious ointment upon the head that ran down upon the beard, even Aaron's beard, and went down to the skirts of his garments, as the dew of Hermon, and as the dew that descended upon the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord commanded the blessing, even life forevermore. There was blessing when the people were together. Now, have you noticed? This psalm was written by David. And it was written at the time of his coronation. And if you go and look in 2 Samuel chapter 5, at the time of his coronation, you read this in verse 1. Then came all the tribes of Israel to David unto Hebron, and spake, saying, Behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. We're bone of your bone and flesh of your flesh. That's how united they were. Verse 5. So all the elders of Israel came to the king to Hebron, and King David made a league with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. And that was the day that Psalm 133 was written. There was that glorious unity, the 10 and the 2 tribes. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell in unity, to dwell together. And verse 3, as the dew of Hermon, as the dew of descended upon the mountains of Zion, for there the Lord commanded the blessing, even life forevermore. Those were the days. But now Satan has got in amongst the Lord's people. Sheba, a man of Belial, has come in. And he suggested that they have no interest in David. The seed is planted. All of the past is forgotten. The blessing is gone because Satan has got in amongst the Lord's people. And how easily that can happen in these days. In the New Testament church, when Satan gets in amongst the Lord's people. We've all heard of it happening in churches. How sad it is. How easily a little thing gets blown out of proportion. And what we're going to see as we move on through the second and third of these sections is the way in which this grows and gets worse. The New Testament church is warned about these things. In Jude chapter 4, ungodly men who crept in unknown, turning the grace of God into lasciviousness. Isn't that exactly what Sheba was doing there? As he called the 10 tribes to depart from David. Or Paul, writing to the Galatians, speaks of false brethren brought in to bring them into bondage. We're warned of these things in the New Testament. It's that continuity I spoke of in Revelation chapter 12. The devil's always delighted to divide the Lord's people, whether it's the Old Testament tribes, Judah and Israel, or whether it's the New Testament church. He delights to divide the Lord's people. And that's what we want to look at as we carry on in these second and third parts. Now, as we go through them, there are two key persons. One, of course, is Joab. He's mentioned frequently. And the other is King David, who seems to be very much in the background, not doing very much at all. But he's king. So remember that as we come. Verses 3 to 13. David appointed Amasa, commander-in-chief, to gather all the forces together and meet him in 3 days' time. Verse 4. Then the king said to Amasa, assemble me the men of Judah within 3 days, and be thou here present. Now it's interesting that, as it goes on, we see that David is anxious to nip this revolt by Sheba in the bud, because he's learned the lesson of his son Absalom, how he allowed him to revolt and did nothing. And Absalom drew people in, and the movement grew and grew. So Absalom and that episode is still upon his mind. But notice what he does. Verse 4, then the king said to Amasa. Now Amasa had been second in command. He wasn't the commander-in-chief. Joab had been the commander-in-chief. If you go back to chapter 18 and verse 2, you can see that he was the first. So Joab has just been passed over, and Amasa is now appointed to gather the troops together. Just a little dig by David, displeased that Joab had disobeyed him and slain his son Absalom. But he had perfect right to discipline him. It was disobedience, but he'd done nothing about it. Just this sly little dig. This is a man after God's own heart, but he was neglecting his duties as king. The law matters as well as the objectives, and doing things in the right manner, it matters. And so now we find that Amasa is appointed, but he doesn't turn up on time with all the troops. And so what then happens? We find now that David goes on to appoint Abishai to gather troops together. Now, if you go back again to chapter 18, you find that he was third in command. So a second time, Joab is passed over. And then we find, as this episode unfolds, that they all come together at this great stone. And Joab unilaterally decides, well, I'll go as well. So he gathers some men up, and they go. So all three of them meet at the great stone. And what does Joab do? Been passed over twice. Verse 7. The king spared Mephibosheth. Sorry, wrong chapter. Then went there out after him Joab's men, and the Cherethites, and the Pelethites, and all the mighty men. And they went out of Jerusalem to pursue after after Sheba, the son of Bichri. They met in verse 8 at the great stone. And in verses 8 to 13, Joab just takes over. He's been passed over twice. He used to be in commander-in-chief, but he just takes over. Verse 8, then they were at the great stone which is in Gibeon, and Amasa went before them. And Joab's garment that he had put on was girded unto him, and upon it a girdle with a sword fastened upon his loins in the sheath thereof. And as he went forth, it fell out. And Joab said to Amasa, art thou in health, my brother? And Joab took Amasa by the beard with the right hand to kiss him. But Amasa took no heed to the sword that was in Joab's hand. So he smote him there in the 5th rib, and shed out his bowels to the ground, and struck him not again as he died. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, pursued after Sheba, the son of Bichri. Joab's a man who does things his way. I did it my way. People love to have that song at a funeral, don't they? And I always shrink when I hear that. Going to a funeral and telling God, I did it my way. And the answer is probably that's the trouble. So Joab now has taken over. In spite of David's wish, he is now leading. And the price has been a murder. He should be disciplined for this. But nothing of that is heard. He just takes over. Once again, Joab is leading the armed forces. The thing about Joab was he was intensely loyal to David and to Israel, but he did things his way. No interest in the law, the right way and the wrong way to do things. But he was loyal to David, loyal to Israel, but not to the law. He did things his way. Then we come to the 3rd episode, Joab's peace settlement, verses 14 to 23. Finally, Joab and David's forces have trapped Sheba there in Abel Beth-Mashen. And Joab makes a peace with this wise woman. No reference to David. This is a man who does things his way, once again. And they agree together that for Sheba's head thrown over the wall, Joab would withdraw all the forces and they'd go away. The deal was done. And so Sheba now was duly executed, and the problem would seem to be over. But just think of this man, Joab. He'd killed Abner in the past. He'd killed Absalom. And now he'd killed Amasa. And of course, he'd connived in and arranged the murder of Sheba. And David hadn't been entirely free of involvement with his lawlessness, because remember how David used this man to achieve the death of Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. So we can see things so sharply. Here is Joab, intensely loyal to David, to the Lord's people, but doing things by any means, any expedient means, any way that achieved his goal. And here is David, failing to administer the law, failing to ensure that the law is obeyed. They say that opposites attract. Well, that's very much the case here. David and Joab, they both knew what needed to be done. David didn't do it, and Joab did it by breaking the law. So a childish quarrel that began in chapter 19 has now escalated. There have been murders. There's been disloyalty to the king. All sorts of laws have been broken. And all because a son of Belial, Sheba, had come amongst the Lord's people. And isn't that what we're warned about in the church today? The evil one loves to get in amongst the Lord's people. He loves to cause dissension. Go again to Psalm 133. Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. Like the precious ointment upon the head that ran down upon the beard, even Aaron's beard, that went down to the skirts of his garments. Everything was covered, as the dew of Hermon, as the dew that descended upon the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord commanded the blessing, even life forevermore. That's what's on offer. But the devil got in amongst David's kingdom, and the people of God were divided. And the same thing happens in the church. The devil gets in, and there's no more blessing, because the Lord commands the blessing where the people of God are behaving themselves. Just think about the New Testament church. We have instructions about management of the New Testament church. Joab wasn't much of a man for laws and instructions. That was the source of the trouble there. But we're told, aren't we? Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he said, let all things be done decently and in order. A church where that doesn't happen is heading for trouble, just as Israel was. Or Paul again, writing to the Corinthians, he says, the rest I will come and set in order when I come. He was anxious that things should be properly constituted, properly set up there in Corinth. Or when he wrote to Titus, for this cause I left you in Crete, that there thou shouldst set up in order the things that are wanting, and ordain elders in every city, as I had appointed thee. See, Paul, with all his evangelistic fervor and his preaching, was one who respected the right way for the people of God to behave, the right way to handle difficulties, the right way to set the gospel out even before the people. And what about ourselves as church members? What instructions are given for us? Do you remember Romans 12 and verse 10? Be kindly affectioned one to another, with brotherly love in honor, preferring one another. What a standard. We're told that our relationships in the church are to be characterized by that brotherly love. We've been, in our midweek meeting, we've been often recently on the subject of brotherly love. Love amongst the brethren. Hebrews 13 verse 1. Let brotherly love continue. We need to remember that the church is not just a club. It's not just a place where we meet with friends. It's the bride of Christ. How careful we need to be as we come along, as we take responsibility within the church. How careful we need to be. We're told, aren't we, that the devil, as a roaring lion, seeks whom he might consume. That passage again in Revelation chapter 12. Driving the church into the wilderness, anxious to destroy the church. Remember how Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers within the church. Those who are the opposite to Sheba, the man of Belial. Just think of how different things could have been if David, as king, there at the end of chapter 19, had stepped in and said, well, but wait a minute. This isn't right. And poured some oil on troubled water. But where was David? He knew the problem, but he didn't act. And so often that happens in the church today. There are problems, and the leaders don't act. So it's a great privilege to be members of the bride of Christ, to seek to uphold the fellowship, to promote lovely, brotherly love. And to ensure that things are done decently and in order, that the Lord is truly the head of the church. Well, perhaps an unusual subject for a Sunday evening, but oh, how we need, for the good of the church, to take heed to these things. As we go about our business in the church, it's the bride of Christ, and we're part of that. And one day, she'll be presented to the bridegroom without spot and without blemish. What a day that will be.